So some of the challenges we have on Earth right now is that our food system contributes a lot of carbon footprint, mostly because we have to truck our food from rural areas far away from urban areas. So when we're thinking about closed loop system, we're dealing with this much smaller, faster feedback loop than what we have on Earth. So if there's a significant increase of CO2 or methane within the closed loop system, we're going to get a much faster increase in temperature within the closed loop system. So we have to get our handle on how we can minimize the food miles, how we can minimize the production of methane and CO2, and somehow mitigate what's already in the atmosphere. So this needs to be kind of in the back of our mind as we're designing the food system. And because we're providing artificial gravity and we're designing a much larger space habitat, we can begin to think about best practices that are now being used on Earth to tackle some of the nitrogen recycling issues. So this is a farm where they have a series of rotational paddocks. You can see the yellow bubbles. So these yellow bubbles are rotational grazing cells. And if we take a look at, a module within the system, it's composed of multiple grazing cells. You have, each cell. Somehow I'm having trouble making the red dot show up. So you can see the blue ribbon kind of wrapping around the bottom of a yellow cell, and then there's a green ribbon below that. So the yellow part is where we will rotate our cows and sheep and goats and chickens through. And then, when the raindrops comes down and hits the manure, we have storm water that's rich in organic content. And then the blue ribbon is where we can have stormwater swale that will help us treat some of that really dense nutrient content and provide liquid fertilizer for the food forest, which is the green ribbon there. So the idea is to rotate the animals so that we don't allow the animals to continue to trample on the same pasture and make it barren ultimately. So this is sort of the best practice in terms of reutilizing some of the nutrient content from the animal manures while mitigating any nutrient loading into the adjacent water bodies. Because when our rivers are overwhelmed with the nitrogen loading, it can actually cause algae bloom and dead zones in the ocean. So this is another possible best practice in a much smaller footprint type of condition. It's called a rotational cell. So you will rotate the animal around like a clock, and then you will integrate multiple species in one herd. Let's just say you will rotate your cows first, and they're going to eat grasses that are higher, and then you will rotate the goats and sheep. They will eat the grasses that are slightly lower and then shorter, and then you'll rotate the chickens through. They'll eat, whatever's at the very bottom. So the benefit of doing this is that we can have as many animals as we can, a diverse herd of multiple species within the smallest footprint possible within a space habitat. And also these different species, they are able to control the parasites from other species. They tend to have different kinds of parasites as hosts. So I think on Earth, our challenge is that meat eating tends to consume a lot more land and resources. So, when we're designing the space food system, we want to be thinking about what's the optimal diet that is the most beneficial to human health. And then, how do we then provide that optimal composition of nutrients that human needs within the smallest footprint possible in a way that will help restore and maintain the ecosystem within the biome without any long-term environmental consequences. So you can see how animal-based foods are on the right-hand side and the plant-based foods are on the left-hand side. We compare, the types of resources that they consume we need to sort of find our balance. Initially, we want to cut out the animals completely, but most of the faculty members on the project said nobody's going to want to go without being able to eat their steak. Particularly if we're trying to accommodate space tourism, people are paying $50 million a ticket. You're not going to go to Mars for 18 months without having your steak. So we do have like VIP requests in terms of making sure that we can get our cows into the space habitat. So most likely we're going to have to bring the embryos of humans and animals and raise them once we get up there, so we don't have to deal with a lot of payload. We have to bring seeds or plants up there and then grow them all up there. Once we can fill our biomes up in space through in-space manufacturing, then we can somehow figure out how to implement the space food system you guys are creating today. So protein is very important, and without nitrogen, we cannot form any protein in our bodies. So fish has been considered as a more feasible way of providing proteins. Worms, some astronauts eat worms in order to get the proteins, and it's gross, but we are integrating worms and we love our worms. We'll tell you all about the worms today. They're essential in terms of allowing us to continue to get our proteins in space. So integrating aquaponics into the space food system could be helpful because the feces from the fish will provide the nutrient needed by the plants, and the plant roots will help process some of that organic content and keep the water clean. So the beneficial interdependence here is something worth considering. And then there's also different smaller footprint living systems that can be integrated into urban design armature. So this kind of aquaponics system can actually be part of the urban design, right? Within the planter, you don't necessarily need to have dirt. You can have a totally different system that is water-based or aquaponic or aeroponic system, like what Mahona presented earlier. You can also use the food system, the small prototypes we're developing, as a building block for structures, right? For architecture for different parts of the space habitat. So here's an example of how we make things footprint efficient. I think last time we haven't really thought about layering things up, right? Being able to do the most out of the smallest footprint possible. So this is an example of layering things up. And then as we're thinking about reducing the food miles, one possible best practice to consider from the earth-based applications is to look at permacultural zoning. So permacultural zoning is all about trying to basically think about the distance between where you need to go and where you are and the frequency of visits. So for example, if you have chicken coops and you need to go get the eggs from the chickens maybe twice a day, then you want to put the chicken coops closer to where you live, right? And then if you're talking about cows, you don't need to go see the cows every day if you can figure out how to get the cows clean water. So you can see that the outer ring zone number 5, the gray zone, is a managed wilderness zone where we can have foraging. Food forest, where the animals can basically just find their food on the ground. Maybe there's acorns or whatever drop off the trees. And then zone 4 is where we might have animals that need some care, but not too frequently, where we can have our rotational paddocks. And then zone 3 is where you got your fruit trees and more intensively used pasture, cash crops. And zone 2 is where we might get semi-intensely cultivated food production, your greenhouses that might need more frequent visits. And then zone 1 is where we get, maybe chicken coops and other plants that need more intensive care. So basically, when we're laying things out, we want to be thinking about the frequency of visits. We want to really reduce the food mile that we're working with. So this is a similar principle, to really think about the different uses you're going to have and how frequently you have to visit them to maintain them. But automation is the most important thing. That early, the video we watched was designed to be fully automated. So then we're designing this rover to be a fully automated food production system for the astronauts, so they can focus on what they need to do and yet have fresh food out in space. So when we're designing at the city level, we also want to be thinking about how many trips we're taking, and where are we going, where are the destinations, how often do we need to go. So if we're thinking about, you know, going to the library or going to work, if you're going to work, then we want to minimize the distance between work and where people live. If we're talking about, you know, shopping for grocery, that's probably once a week. If we're talking about going to school might need to be closer. So, you know, just think about the kinds of destinations that people would need to go and how frequently they would need to go. So as you're laying things out collectively, you can minimize the vehicle mile travel and therefore the CO2 emission, carbon footprint of the city that we design. So here's an example, it's kind of dark, of how people design self-sufficient acres. So each acre is a homestead that has its own water and energy, has its own rotational paddocks and food forest, and stormwater swale that we talked about. So that could be a possible model for you to consider. Another possible model for you to consider is something that our aerospace engineering faculty have been exploring. So you can see these very small boxes here. So this is the rover that we're designing now. We're trying to automate these rovers to produce food and have its own self-sustaining nitrogen cycle. So that ultimately, you know, we want to use Libra's propulsion system to make the rover fly up and, you know, like a drone. So the rover can basically situate themselves wherever they need to be in the space habitat. And when we're hungry, the rover is going to come down and serve us food. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So here's a model of the rover where we can see all these gas separation chamber on the side. Do you guys see the red dot? Like somehow I'm not seeing the red dot. Yes. Yeah, there. You see the red dot here? So these are separation chambers for the different gases: oxygen, CO2, methane, ethylene, and then water. And then we have an upper level for the plants. We're going to grow plants here, and the roots going to be coming down here and use the aquaponic system to have those nutrient mist come out. And then we have a permaculture bin where we're going to be growing mushrooms and worms. And then the worms are going to convert the mushrooms into compost tea that's very dense in nutrient. So we'll figure out how to convert the compost tea into a nutrient solution over here or into yeast solution. So we can use the yeast to produce bioenergy through microbial fuel cells and so on. So we're trying to figure out how to really recycle nutrient back into the nutrient solution by having nitrogen fixing plants and nitrogen fixing mushrooms to convert the atmospheric nitrogen into the plant substrates in there into a compost tea, and so we can continue to provide nitrogen to the plants